Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on the evolving dynamics of the EU-US trade relations and China's role in shaping them. My name is Joanna Sopinska. I'm a senior trade correspondent for the Capital Forum in Brussels, and I will be moderating our conversation today. Over the next around 60 minutes, we will explore 4 key themes. First, we will look at China's influence on transatlantic trade relations, then on current EU-US trade dynamics, policy choices to counter China's predatory trade actions, and at the end, we will discuss the future scenarios that could reshape the EU-US-China trade relations. Our aim is to go beyond the headlines and take a closer look at the decisions, strategic decisions confronting both the EU and the US as China's economic and trade policies grow increasingly aggressive, assertive. We are fortunate to have an outstanding panel of experts to unpack those topics for us. Let me introduce Dan Canistra, partner at Crowell and Mooring. We also have Mark Di Placido, policy advisor at American Compass. We have Kevin Keller, visiting fellow in East Asian legal studies at Harvard Law School and fellow in history and policy at Harvard Kennedy School. And finally, we have Dennis Shea, former US ambassador to the WTO and currently executive vice president and chair of the J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. It's truly an honor to have you on the panel. So I'd like to start our discussion with quite a general question about the role of China in the EU-US relations. So does China play a stabilizing role, or rather it's a source of tension, additional tension in the EU-US relations? What's your take on this? So maybe Kevin, you will start us off with more like a short historical perspective.
Yeah, my pleasure. And first, thanks for inviting me and thanks for organizing this conference. I've been here since first thing this morning. I think it's been a really fascinating collection of discussions. I think the question of whether China plays a stabilizing role or a destabilizing role in the EU-US relationship, to me, it almost seems like a very easy question. I think it's destabilizing. But I think the reason is because if you look at the longer history of international trade order, it's sort of an inherently unstable order, that it's difficult to collect a bunch of countries to get together over a long period of time to align their trade policy in a way that is stable. But even under GATT and under the WTO, there were repeated rounds of negotiations. And so I think because this is a historical order that always does see fluctuations, what we see right now is China is sort of the latest challenge that the EU and that each country needs to think about.
And Dennis, you have a practical experience in dealing with China.
Sure.
When you were at the WTO. So what's your take?
Well, let me also thank you for having me, and let me say whatever I state today is my own personal view and not the view of any organization for whom I may work. So I need to say that at the outset. But I think we could get into how the during my experience, how the EU, I try to work with the EU to help manage the problems created by China, state subsidies and state-owned enterprises, and I wasn't very successful. So maybe I shouldn't be the person you should ask that question. I just kind of failed on it, I think. But I think there's a lot that the U.S. and the EU can work together on. We really have a shared challenge vis-a-vis China. Obviously, the market distortions caused by massive state subsidies have impacted the United States, but they're impacting Europe in a big way. with respect to electric vehicles and solar panels and steel, et cetera. The EU's on track to have a 300 billion euro trade deficit with China. When we talk about trade deficits, we think they're not necessarily very good, at least the Trump administration, but $300 billion trade deficit with China, and President Macron has called it a life or death concern. We both have supply chain vulnerabilities with respect to rare earths and other critical raw materials, which are essential to green technologies and high-tech and military applications. We both are subject to cyber attacks and espionage and intellectual property theft. The United States, it's well documented, the United States has suffered a tremendous amount of losses associated with intellectual property theft. And the war effort. I mean, China is an enabler of the Russian war against Ukraine. It's providing components for missiles and drones and maybe sharing targeting intelligence. So I think we have a lot to be working on together. We have our own issues, EU and the US. We could get into that. But I think overall the big picture is that there's more challenges that we have in common than concerns that we have with each other.
So my next question is, what prevents the EU and the US to work together to address those Chinese distortive practices? We heard from Stephen Vaughan that apparently it's a political decision not to do so. The US wants to deal with China on its own, but wouldn't it be better to do it together? Any thoughts?
Sure. So I guess I'll try to bridge it a little bit between maybe the question about the history of the current trade paradigm that was sort of framed in the first question and sort of where we are today, because I do think it's the crux of the issue between the United States and the EU. I think China has sort of precipitated a recognition first in the United States that you cannot have a trade paradigm that permits persistent growing trade imbalances among the biggest participants of the system. If you sort of go back to the foundation of the system in 1947, the GATT, the entire system was set up to try to achieve better trade balances after industry was completely decimated across Europe and East Asia during World War II, and the United States had over half of the world's industrial capacity, half of the world's GDP. Europe was decimated. You also had at the same time this growing threat of communism in the Soviet Union to the east that the new trade bloc was sort of meant to counter, both politically in making sure that Western European economies weren't destabilized after World War II the way they were after World War I, and to bring additional third and developing countries into the West's orbit over the following decades. When you sort of expanded that system that had real, national interests and more traditional foreign policy considerations to be sort of this global vision that accepted China in 2001, despite China's, lack of a liberal, democratic, and open market, you sort of replaced what was a very realist and, policy that could support national interests of Western countries with something that was theoretical and I think ultimately utopian. And I think what we're seeing now is a division between a United States that wants to re-recognize the supreme interests of the nation over a grand vision that I think Europe is not ready to let go of. And whether we'll continue to move forward together to confront a country like China that does not embrace Western market practices, does not embrace Western political practices, or whether Europe is going to face the same fate as the United States, as some of its economies like Germany have already been facing since 2018, I think is going to be a decision that Europe and its community is going to have to come together and answer.
Mm-hmm.
Offer a slightly different perspective and what I think is probably the biggest barrier to negotiating and resolving some of these conflicts It's the absence of a known destination. And I was thinking about this on the way over. One of the words in the panel, this particular panel uses the word navigating the trade landscape. But navigating usually suggests you have a destination actually in mind. And I'm not quite sure exactly what the destination in mind is of the parties. I don't think the parties themselves have even thought very much about that question. And if you don't have a destination in mind, how could you ever begin to solve the problem? You instead end up just focusing on the conflicts without any particular end or objective. So to me, that is one of the great barriers to resolving the conflicts. And I don't think that's necessarily a U.S. issue, a China issue, or an EU issue, that I think there needs to be a little bit of a pause to say, what is it exactly that we're trying to achieve here? Are we trying to rebuild a industrial manufacturing base in the U.S.? Is that our first and foremost priority? Are we trying to focus on particular critical sectors in the industry in the future? Is that our priority? Future technologies, value-added jobs? What exactly is it that we're trying to achieve? Mm-hmm. And until we can answer that question coherently, to me, I can't see how we can possibly begin to resolve some of these conflicts, because it's just an endless hop from conflict to conflict without an end in mind.
Mm-hmm. In the recent years, there was quite a lot of criticism in the US that the EU is not taking a position on China, that the EU is too soft on China. Over recent months, the EU has been toughening its stance, its approach to China. As it was mentioned earlier today, only this week the Commission opened an investigation into Temu, the e-commerce platform. The Commission also moved to an in-depth investigation into another Chinese company. And the Commission also opened an anti-dumping investigation into another product from China that is dumped on the EU market. So there's been change also in Brussels of how Europe perceives China and how Europe wants to challenge China. Are these efforts recognized here in the US, or it's still not enough for the US to be able to get together and face those Chinese distortive practices together? Yeah, please.
I'll just go back a little history, since we started with history. When I was at the WTO, we try to work with China, with the EU with respect to China. We worked on these trilateral rules designed to constrain Chinese overcapacity standalone enterprises. This was the EU, Japan, the United States. These rules weren't going to have any impact on China. They don't care, about the rules. But the EU, for example, refuse to insert the word China in the documents, even though the whole thing was about China.
That's very European.
And one of the things as part of our reform agenda at the WTO was to reaffirm, you mentioned GATT, reaffirm that the international trading system now located at the WTO in Geneva was based on market-oriented principles, trade among at least countries that have market orientation. Part of what the U.S. does in accessions to the WTO is to insist that countries that are acceding to the adopt more market-oriented practices. And China, of course, has gone the other direction, and the EU would not support that. Just a simple, the response to me was that would imply that China can't be part of the WTO. So I think the EU, my perception is the EU's come away, becoming more realistic with respect to China. I don't think, when President von der Leyen called for strategic de-risking, I think in March of 2023, I don't think there's been a lot of meat on the bones since March of 2023, my perception. And then you have a lot of member states doing things, particularly Germany, that seem to be inconsistent with a de-risking policy. So from the U.S. perspective, it's very confusing about what EU is up to, what their goals are. They're really because you have so many different voices in the EU, and they sometimes are working at cross purposes.
Anyone would want to comment on this as well?
I'll offer one additional comment, because I think embedded in your question was the European Union is taking action against imports for China in a particular sector. Does that make the U.S. side happy? Is that a negotiating offer in that we're commonly retaliating against China? And I think it comes back to my earlier point. Is there some negotiating objective? Is there some policy reason for the EU doing that? Is that something that the U.S. is seeking? For example, is the U.S. seeking to limit Chinese imports into the European Union, or to address the more systematic problems within the Chinese market? Because if the second is the case, individual markets are less important. Isn't it equally important who is selling into Brazil, for example? Because everybody is competing in Brazil. We can't necessarily look at countries operating bilaterally and saying we've solved a problem with respect to China in this market, in this sector, and therefore the problem is solved if you still haven't addressed the global systematic problems.
Yeah.
No, and I would just add to that, that is sort of what explains the difference between the first Trump administration's posture on trade and the second, is that we specifically tried to focus tariffs and trade actions largely on China and Chinese industry in the first administration. The bilateral deficit on sort of an overall level has started to come down. And has come down significantly even this year. But Chinese exports have still skyrocketed to third countries, and the U.S.'s overall trade deficit has continued to grow. And so there needs to be, from the United States perspective, a global approach to countries that we're tariffing, because Chinese goods are still coming in through third markets. And when it comes to Europe, I would say, you can look at it as a collaborative effort from the United States, or you could also just look at it as Europe needing to adopt the same trade posture as the United States to protect its industries, which are facing much greater competition from what some people are already calling the second China shock, based on the industries that China has targeted under its Made in China 2025 policy starting in 2015. Than the industries that were most affected by the first China shock after the WTO entry in 2001. Otherwise, the United States has made clear, Europe is now running a $300 billion deficit with China. They're still running a $240 billion with the surplus with the United States last year. The United States is not going to balance out Europe's economy by absorbing its deficit with China anymore. So Europe is going to have to decide whether it's going to protect its industries, its workers, its wages, and its industrial competitiveness, or whether it wants to end up like the United States in 2015, 2016.
Okay, so let's now move maybe to discuss the EU-US current policy dynamics. As we have seen, there is a little bit of a change of a tone in the U.S. From the U.S. administration, especially after the Scotland trade deal. Does it signal a lasting change or just a tactical pause? What do you think?
I think suggesting tactical pause is giving far too much credit to those undertaking the pause. I think it's a pause while attention is diverted. I don't think there's anything particularly strategic about it in the U.S.
Well, I mean, Mark mentioned the $240 billion trade deficit in goods in 2024. I mean, that is a major concern for the United States. If you look at the national trade estimate, which the USTR puts out every year, I think the biggest, these are lists, catalogs of non-tariff barriers, trade barriers to U.S. exports. The biggest section is often the EU. I think it was 34 pages in March of 2025. So this has been longstanding in the Trump administration, but also in the Biden administration. There's a perception in the United States that Europe has technical barriers to trade, standardization requirements, conformity assessment requirements, requirements that block agricultural products, and $240 billion is a big is a big number. I think it was 235, but last year. But it's a big number, and we've been raising these concerns for many years. So I think the effort with the EU is part of the overall global effort to reduce U.S. trade deficits. We ran a $1.2 trillion trade deficit in goods in 2024. We've run about $20 trillion since the WTO. And from the U.S. perspective, this is simply unsustainable. We're financing current consumption by selling off our assets and the future income from those assets. So a big part of solving the problem is with our friends from the EU. We have to get more balanced trade with the EU. So I think it's, and that was one of the arrangements, the agreement, the Scotland Agreement, is part of this overall approach, because we need to reduce the trade deficit to onshore manufacturing, improve our industrial base, and make sure we have a sustainable future.
But is the reduction of the deficit an end goal? And if so, what if the deficit is reduced just by half? Does it mean that the EU-US trade relations should be still very tense? Is the US still gonna try to put more tariffs on the EU? Where will it end? So referring to your question, what's the goal? What's the final goal? And how to make the US happy? What the EU should do to be perceived as a proper partner for the US in terms of trade, of course.
Well, I'm not part of the Trump administration, but they have an agreement. We have an agreement that was struck, and I think the U.S. is fundamentally happy with that agreement. I think President Trump has said he's happy with the agreement. So what the impact of that agreement will be on the U.S. trade deficit with the EU and the global U.S. trade deficit, I think, remains to be seen. It's relatively new.
No, and I mean, that's to the extent there are, people in my organization, and I'm one of these people trying to build this sort of larger plan that, that is coherent and that can be, articulated to, American business and our trading partners and our allies. Like, what is that destination? Balance has to be that defining goal and that end destination, because that was a destination set out in the charter of the IMF. There were allowances made for it in import quotas in the GATT agreement for Europe. I mean, until the world came off the gold standard in 1971, we did have that balance, and people who are really concerned about trade issues and the deficit that are influential on the administration and the people defining this conversation, that is where the measures, that is the thing to measure trade policy against. Obviously, there are a lot of political funnels that both on the domestic and the foreign policy side that Stephen Vaughn spoke to earlier in his remarks today. And so how these come together in trade agreements with specific countries, and including the European Union, and the effect that these initial wave of investments are going to have on production in the United States that becomes competitive in the world market again, and increases demand for American goods rather than American assets. That is going to have to play out over some time. I mean, the current situation the United States finds itself in played out over 30 to 40 years, right? And so it's not going to change in 2 years or 4 years, but I think all of the conversations are headed in sort of a right direction, and to the extent they're recognizing the current system is unsustainable.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I just want to add, I mean, I'm probably the oldest guy on this panel, and I'm old enough to remember when economic security and national security were separate silos, particularly among Republicans. They're never the two should meet. They're two separate tracks. But I think what has changed, which has been disruptive to some of our trading partners, is there's a recognition that economic security is fundamental to U.S. national security, and that is the exact language in the U.S. national security strategy, which was much discussed, which was been released earlier recently. That so much about that is trade, economics, industrial base, and that is core to U.S. National security. And I think when I was at the WTO, I don't think many of my colleagues put the two together. They were sort of living in their trade silo, and they weren't seeing the bigger picture of trade and its impact on other aspects of national life, national power.
Yes.
So one of the topics I study is China's accession to the WTO, and there's a memoir written by a Chinese official that I thought was really interesting, where he described negotiating with the United States as trying to give a haircut to an impatient child, and that whenever the scissors got close to his head, the kid kept wrenching his head around. And what I take from this is that if you look at China's accession to WTO, both on the Chinese side and the US side, there was this desire that we have to get this right. Like, if we can get these protocols in place, we can settle this and we can have a peaceful, mutually beneficial trade relationship going forward. And that hasn't worked out. The reason we're here today is because trying to just put something in stone and say, we figured this out, we're done, it doesn't really work. What does that mean for the EU? I don't mean to say that there's no hope, but I think it's to focus on the rest of the world. That the United States is a very important country, but if you look at demographic patterns over the coming century, there are other countries over the world that will become sort of centers of gravity of population, of workers, and that a way that the EU can sort of build up more leverage against the United States and be a little bit less susceptible to the whiplash that can come with working with U.S. officials is building up expertise and relationships and trade relationships with these other countries around the world.
Yes, and it seems that there is also an effort to find some solutions to issues where there is still some disappointment, because maybe the US is satisfied with the deal that was made in Scotland, but the EU not so much. So, and there is, so it was quite a big concession that the EU agreed to allow for those tariffs to be imposed. There was talk about retaliatory measures, but it didn't happen. Also because of the security situation. So again, as you said, there is this now we see a merge of both national and economic security issues. So for the EU, it was of course Russia, and the EU didn't want to retaliate, because the reaction of the U.S. could be that President Trump could cut the support for Ukraine in exchange. So this was the main concern, and as I said, there are some efforts to find a middle ground solution. For example, the U.S. government proposed to the EU that in exchange of its of softening its big tech regulation, the U.S. could soften also its tariffs on steel and aluminium. So I would like to hear from you. What do you think about this proposal? Is it realistic that the EU could accept it? Anyone? We start with Dennis.
Well, I think it's realistic that the EU can accept it. I'm not. I mean, that's just negotiation. I mean, you do this and I'll do that. And I mean, there is perception in the U.S., particularly among the Trump administration, that these digital service taxes, the Digital Markets Act, the digital services are directed on a discriminatory basis towards U.S. companies, and that is the perception. So the administration's defending U.S. companies you're in Brussels. You know better the EU mindset and the EU officials, but I think it's a negotiation, and everything's possible in negotiation. Just about everything.
Sure. I guess I would just maybe less commenting on the immediate state of the negotiations, and maybe just sort of a larger comment on the sort of competing frameworks, I guess, of how we're seeing these negotiations. There's, I think, a larger notion, the way Orrin Cass, my boss, has put it in an essay in Foreign Affairs, is there's a shift, I think, going on in the United States toward a grander theory of reciprocity, both on the security front and on the trade front. And Europe, just based on reality, not based on sort of a normative principle, cannot expect to rely on the United States for its security anymore. Like, Europe basically is in a position where it's going to have to step up and take care of sort of the civilizational essentials that every regime has had to take care of, that I think since World War II the United States has taken on more of the burden of. And that's a natural result of, the imbalances that have corrected themselves since the end of World War II, right? It's not 1945 anymore. It's also not 1989 anymore at the end of the Cold War, where we thought we might be at the end of history, right? History has clearly continued, it bulldozed its way across Ukraine's border 5 or 6 years ago. So we all need to step up civilizationally if we're going to be reciprocal allies and thriving civilizations in our own right, and that's extremely necessary in the face of nations like China, who are sort of hyper aware of what it looks like based on their experience in the 20th century to not be in a position of prominence, especially on the industrial front.
Honestly, when I hear NATO contributions used as an explanation for an otherwise incoherent trade policy, I have a hard time making the link between those two, and I think that they should be kept as separate issues. One was commercial issues, the other is a national defense issue, and I struggle to see any relationship between those two things. But on this particular sector where everything is a negotiation, are we really going to adopt the position that everything is a negotiation? And shouldn't every other country, if that is sound policy, be adopting precisely the same thing? If Brazil has a deficit with Chile, shouldn't Brazil be putting in tariffs? What if we have a surplus against Mexico? Should Mexico be imposing tariffs against us? Does anybody that we run a surplus with, does that mean necessarily that we are discriminating against them? I recognize that there can be negotiations in industrial sectors. Steel somehow has become one of those core industrial sectors that has been the subject of trade negotiations for about 40 years, but there are many others as well. And I recognize that those can take place, but I'm not sure it makes sense to be negotiating each one of these as their own individual commercial transaction.
I think it's very easy to explain to the average American voter. We're spending billions of dollars to protect Europe. We are fulfilling our obligation under NATO to spend a percentage of our budget on defense. And many European countries are not doing that, not even filling their 2% obligation. So we're spending all this money to defend Europe, and then we're running a $236 billion deficit with Europe, and they're blocking our exports through non-tariff barriers and other mechanisms. That's very easy for the American people to understand, and I think that's one of the reasons why President Trump got reelected, because he made that was part of his brief.
Yes. What I can say, being in Brussels, I can say that we are talking about China shock. I think for Europe, it's U.S. shock as well at the same time, because not only tariffs, but also defense issues are now in a totally different place that they were some 5 or 10 years ago. So there is a lot happening at the same time, and Europe is struggling to find its place between the U.S. and China, and feels being under attack from both, actually. And there is, I think, a lot of thinking how to react, and it's not just talking. It takes sometimes a lot of time for Brussels to walk the talk, but it's happening. You can tell this. The Commission has published 2 weeks ago its economic security strategy. There is a lot of ideas there how to use the tools that are in place, the trade tools, how they can be used to defend Europe. And I think they are gonna finally start. They will start using those tools. But what I wanted to ask you now is that indeed a lot is changing in Europe as well, and there is this political pressure to the risk from both China and the U.S. at the same time, regarding particularly regarding supply chain resilience and economic security. How, though, this situation, the strategy, which puts the U.S. and China in one basket, is perceived in Washington?
Well, I'd say they're completely different economic models, right? And so it's a sort of going to be, I think, a political choice of who the winners and the losers in Europe's economy are going to be. So, for basically the last 30 years of China being a full member, or 25 years of China being in WTO, they have pursued a very explicit policy of an export-driven economy. And if you look at the breakdown in the GDP of both countries, right, China's consumption share of their GDP is less than 40%, which is by far the world low. Their investment is also 40%, which is an enormous number. In the U.S., our consumption is 68%, and our investment's only 17 or 18%. And so, China is much more insistent on their economic model than the United States is able to be, because we have a democratic system where the winners and losers are constantly fighting it out. China has a single party that has decided industry is our goal, and it doesn't really matter what the rest of the world says about it. And they've continued to insist on this strategy despite pushback from their trade partners now. And so if Europe wants to, if Europe wants to keep its borders open to that kind of economy, it's going to see its industries hollowed out. If Europe wants to recognize that the entire world needs to start putting pressure on China to adjust their system, because that's the only way that the problem is going to be solved, I think that's the far better approach. The United States, though, I think on a bipartisan basis, though, has decided that we are not absorbing China's excess capacity anymore. Like we just cannot decide to do it. And I really hope that Europe makes the right decision and joins us.
Just a personal anecdote, I got sent to, even though it wasn't my brief, to represent the United States at the Global Forum on Excess Steel Capacity. I was in Tokyo, and it was about 36 countries, and we wanted to keep the forum going because it shined a light on Chinese steel overcapacity. China wanted to shut it down, and he's the guy who was doing that became the WTO ambassador, then now one of China's negotiators. And the person I followed, whose lead I followed, was the EU representative. I wish I could remember her name. She was so strong vis-a-vis China. I mean, in these personal conversations, like we're not gonna shut this down. We're gonna continue this steel forum. She was I said, I'll just do whatever you say. So I said to her, where are you in Brussels? I mean,
Sabine Weyand?
No, it wasn't Sabine, but it was, she was an Italian woman.
Italian, I know.
She was fantastic. I mean, so I just said, we would meet, and beforehand I said, I'll just follow your lead. So I think we would be happy to follow the EU's lead if they got tougher on China, on some of these predatory practices.
And yes, I think it's gonna happen finally. Now, I wanted to talk about the rare earth metals and what China have done. China has imposed very tough restrictions on exports of those metals. And talking about future cooperation in a positive manner between the EU and the US, could it, the rare earth situation and the Chinese monopoly, could it generate some sort of cooperation between the EU and the US so that they can leverage build a leverage against China? Is it even possible? Is this something that, because both economies are equally affected by those restrictions, so could it be some sort of trigger for them to cooperate closer?
Yeah, I think this is a great opportunity for the two locations to cooperate for two reasons. The first is I think there is a roadmap to what can be built. I'm thinking here, for example, the New York Times reported, I think earlier this week, about how Japan built stronger supply chains for rare earth minerals with Malaysia and Australia in response to a restriction that came out of China. So there is a roadmap that exists, which leads to the second reason, and what Dan started the panel with, which is that this is something where the goal actually exists. That this isn't sort of a grand question of what should our economies look like. It's how can these two locations get better access to these specific resources. And because I think the endpoint is a little bit more granular and a little more specified, that can make cooperation a little bit more easy.
I do note, and it's always very interesting because these conversations frequently involve rare earth metals and that discussion. When you turn to that particular discussion, it is we should all act collectively in the best interest in the whole, but yet when it's other industries, it's highly transactional. And when another party begins to leverage their particular leverage point in an industry, it's criticized as not acting collectively. And I think this again just comes back to you need to look at this collectively. That's part of the problem with looking at it transactionally. If we want to look at the steel industry transactionally, who are we then to criticize the Chinese for looking at rare earth minerals transactionally as well? That's their best leverage point. I don't think we can have these kumbaya moments on a particular industry that's important to us, but not in the whole. Which is not to say I don't think that's an important question, because it is.
Well, I would say dispositionally, right, this is what the president means when he says China's smart, right? Like, all countries need to think what are the basic foundations of our economy that we cannot afford to have weak supply chains on. And I would say I would like to see a robust rare earths sector in Europe. I'd like to see a robust steel sector in Europe. I also want to see one here, though, and that's the first priority for the United States. There are certain sectors we cannot afford to lose, and there are several that we have already lost. And I'm totally fine with countries like Japan and Europe and others deciding that these are essential. We cannot afford to lose these. And we're going to prop them up in certain ways. But the United States has to start thinking like that and doing the same thing, especially if the only country that's producing it, or the country that's overwhelmingly producing it, is not friendly towards us, like China.
I was on the something called the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission for a long time, and about 15 years ago, probably, we wrote a big section on the vulnerability of the United States to Chinese monopolization of rare earths mining and processing, and nothing had happened for like 10 years. It kept repeating it. Nothing happened. But I think now stuff is happening in the United States. The U.S. Defense Department has made a significant investment in a company called MP Materials Corporation, which runs the only rare earth mine in the United States and in California. It's providing price supports for 10 years, so the company won't be subject to price swings. And so I think there's finally movement in the United States, to Mark's point about the U.S. getting its own house in order. And the good thing about rare earths is that they're not really rare. It's just a question of are you willing to cut the permitting times and all the other regulatory process. But I thought the State Department has a group called the Mineral Security Partnership with the EU being a member and with individual members of the EU being members. So I think there's stuff going on with that might be promising.
And should we be concerned that maybe China could use the leverage that it has in rare earths to play the US and the EU against each other, because they can manipulate how much rare earths is sent to one and how much it's sent to the US and how much it's sent to the US, and they can kind of play the two against each other. Would you be concerned about this? Again, that China is behaving smart in a smart way.
I certainly would be. If everything becomes transactional, that becomes part of the transaction. I think it's interesting that in the end we end up fighting a planned economy with 10-year price supports and government subsidies ourselves. But if it's going to be transactional, then of course there'll be winners and losers.
Anyone?
I mean, I think that is a concern, and I think it's already clear with some of the ways, some of the harsher trade measures that have been sort of rolled back, that China is already at a point where it has leverage over the United States, and I'm sure that very much the same with Europe, especially countries like Germany that have a very strong manufacturing presence in China. And so how China will use that leverage and in the coming years, I am concerned about it, and that's why I have the positions that I do on trade and on American supply chains, and that's why I think this conversation is happening, and this administration is trying to move things in a different direction.
And what if China decides to weaponize other strategic products? What then? Would it be at that point maybe the EU, also Japan maybe, and the US would work together, maybe at the G7? Would it be a moment for bigger cooperation against China? I mean.
Yeah, I think collectively, whether people are saying it out loud or not, China is the problem, right? They are the one with the excess capacity. They are the one with the 10-year plan, and they're completely willing to use that leverage to get to their objectives. So the United States obviously has really close economic, political, geopolitical relationships with many players. We have to balance, though, fixing our own sort of economic system and the global imbalances that we're talking about, alongside securing especially these strategic supply chains. And I think on the latter, working with our trade partners and allies is 100% a necessity.
I think I would push back a little bit against the idea that China is the problem. But I think if you go back to before China's economy really took off, if you go back to the 1970s, the 1960s, the 1950s, the consensus wasn't that the World Trade Order was fantastic. The consensus was not that, every place that wanted an industrial sector had an industrial sector. That I think that even if somehow we got China to stop producing so much, there still would be lots of locations all over the world that had domestic problems that need to be solved. And so I do think to some extent it's sort of easy to describe China's productive sector as the problem that needs to be solved because it externalizes it, and we can stop really focusing on what's going on inside the domestic sphere that's also causing distortions it's causing our own economy to look different than we want it to look.
And a follow-up question to you as well. knowing China and its policies, do you think that they would want to accelerate? They would want to go for to fight back even more than they do now with the rare earth restrictions?
I'm not going to speculate on what Chinese leaders sort of want to do or how they would respond to different policies. But I think what I do feel comfortable saying that you can read by documents issued by Chinese leaders of the ICCP is that there is internal dissatisfaction with how the economy is functioning as well. And so the issue is not that the rest of the world has to unite itself against China, which is dead set on some type of industrial policy. It's that China, like every other country in the world, is dealing with really difficult questions about how to organize their own manufacturing sector and industrial sector. And so how they would respond to specific policies, I'm not sure, but I would be a little bit resistant against the idea that they have some plan that's developed over the next 10 years, the next 20 years, and they're sort of executing on that steadfastly without looking or without refining their ideas.
China has weaponized rare earths in the past. I think 2010, 2011 against Japan when there was the incident off the Senkaku Islands. Yeah.
Now I wanted to bring in the IEEPA tariffs, talking about the future scenarios. What if the U.S. Supreme Court strikes down those tariffs? Would it change the balance of power between the U.S., China, and the EU? Or how would it change the power of balance between these countries?
Well, again, I don't represent the Trump administration, but I suspect, and I don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do, but there are other authorities available to the president, Section 232, Section 301, Section 122, some Section 338 from the 1930 Tariff Act that he could utilize to recreate some of the tariffs that were struck down, would be struck down by the Supreme Court. So I think you just have to be, from the European perspective, you have to be careful what you ask for. On the, it could become very problematic and chaotic. My understanding of the EU-U.S. trade deal, the EU got a little bit of a break from the U.S. perspective on 232 auto tariffs from 25 to 15. Got a little bit of a break on pharmaceuticals at 15 when President Trump was suggesting maybe 100% tariffs. So if those go away, I mean, who knows what the recreated picture will look like.
Dan?
I have to comment that I'm not sure a break is found when a tariff goes from 2.5% to 15%, and you should be happy that it didn't go higher. It still increased from 2.5% to 25%. But I think one of the things that hasn't been spoken a lot about, if IEEPA tariffs fall, what happens to the trade agreements negotiated underneath IEEPA as well? Must those also fall as well? Traditionally, not traditionally, I would say historically even, trade agreements are ratified by Congress, not imposed by executive order. And that's largely along the questioning from the Supreme Court on the IEEPA tariffs generally, which is how much room does the president actually have to negotiate trade agreements and tariff authority globally? That power rests with Congress, as clearly specified in the Constitution, so it'll be interesting to see what happens to those trade agreements. I suspect there will be litigation about those as well, and whether or not they're in fact valid after the Supreme Court decision. And while I do recognize it can be replaced with other tariffs as well, many other tariffs actually have disciplines around them, as opposed to the wide open interpretation that IEEPA has been used for.
So I'm afraid we have to wrap up now. And we are ending our discussion with a lot of questions that cannot be answered right now because we don't know yet what the court will decide. Thank you so much for this insightful discussion, and have a nice afternoon, evening.
Everyone, we're going to, well, thank you to everyone for coming. We're going to be having a happy hour across the street at the Hamilton. So please join us. Alcoholic, non-alcoholic beverages. We're picking up the tab. And this has just been an incredible conversation. I know I learned a lot. I'm excited to keep working on our trade product and growing our trade team in the future, and really can't thank enough to our speakers, our panelists, and to everyone for coming today. Thank you so much.